The number 5 best chess game of the 1950s is David Bronstein versus Ernst Rojahn from 1956. Now, David Bronstein is a player many might be familiar with. He was a challenger for the World Championship title in 1951, and he did draw that match against Mikhail Botvinnik. He also wrote one of the best chess books of all time, the Tournament Book for Zurich 1953. He's probably the most innovative and creative top chess player ever. Now, on the other side of the board is Ernst Rojahn. He was Norwegian and was champion of that country for 2 years. Today, being the number 1 player in Norway is a bit more of an achievement, but he was certainly a tough opponent. Bronstein begins the game here with e4, and Rojahn responds with pawn to e5. In fact, Bronstein wrote another classic book, 200 Open Games, dedicated to games that begin with e4 and e5 and all of the beautiful ideas that can emerge thereafter. I really encourage you to check out all of Bronstein's books. He was an incredible writer, and they are all excellent and innovative, just like his chess. Now, after e5, Bronstein continues with knight to f3, knight c6, bishop c4, the Italian game, and after knight f6, knight g5, we get the correct move, pawn to d5. After pawn takes d5 and knight a5, we are in a very theoretical position that has been played millions and millions of times in the games of amateurs and professionals alike. What is normal and expected here is bishop to b5 check, and I would encourage you to play that move most of the time. After pawn c6, you get a trade, and white can pull back to d3, which is kind of trendy, or to e2, or you can play queen to f3, as Alexandra Botez did against Greg Shahade in her IM Speed Chess Championship match. I understand that her play in that game, which was probably her best game in the match, was guided by her coach, Grandmaster Jon Ludvig Hammer, a great theoretician. However, the path that Bronstein is going down after knight a5 is pawn to d3. Objectively, this move is a little bit suspicious, and we'll see why, but Bronstein has a very spectacular justification in mind. Now, black plays the correct next 2 moves. Pawn to h6 first, inconveniencing the knight on g5, pushing it back. You can't go back to e4, which might seem kind of natural at first, because after a trade, you would lose the bishop on c4 for basically nothing. But after h6 and knight f3, we do see Rojahn play the correct move, pawn to e4. This move is very effective, and if white tries something like queen e2, black has proven in multiple games that knight takes c4, pawn takes, and bishop c5 is a really good pawn sacrifice for black. You have a very strong pawn on e4, you've got a dominant bishop controlling the dark squares, your other bishop is coming out effectively, white is going to have to move the knight on f3 very, very soon, and you are going to castle. It's an excellent position full of activity for the black side. But of course, this is not what Bronstein has in mind. After pawn to e4, his intention is to give up the bishop with the brilliant move, pawn takes e4. I don't really care if this move is correct. Objectively, it's not. The computers are going to explain why it's not, and we'll see some refutations that are available to black, but you're sacrificing the piece for 2 pawns here in an absolutely incredible fashion, just defying your opponent to prove that the piece is better than 2 pawns, and it's not easy to do so. One thing that I would say is that when you're playing with a piece against 2 pawns, the long-term chances are with the pawns, because the pawns advance and get stronger as the game goes on. The more they move up the board, the more they gain in strength. The more they are able to work in concert, the more they gain in strength. The more that pieces are traded, in some cases, the stronger the pawns can become. So black really needs to play very accurately, very quickly to refute this kind of idea in the face of a pawn roller, and that can be quite challenging. Don't let the fact that the computer knows how to refute this kind of sacrifice deprive you of the opportunity to play like this. In fact, another great and innovative top chess player, Mikhail Tal, was inspired by this game and produced a different brilliancy against Gitescu that vividly recalled this game, and that Tal said was directly inspired by this incredible game. Rojahn basically has no options here. Bronstein has cast the die, and Rojahn must accept what is effectively a piece gambit instead of the traditional pawn gambit. Now, we see Bronstein centralize his queen here. For the piece, he does have a beautifully centralized queen and two incredible pawns in the middle of the board. Again, there is an urgent need for action from Rojahn. The next 10 moves are going to be critical, and if he doesn't find a counter to the strong pawns and strong centralization that Bronstein has, he will get steamrolled. Now, after queen d4, that knight on c4 is obviously exposed and needs to retreat. Rojahn picks knight to b6, moving back to a safe square, but away from the center of the board. In fact, stronger was knight to d6, which you could be tempted to avoid because you are walking possibly into pawn to e5, and you might think you're blocking this bishop. In fact, pawn to e5 does not work here because after e5 you have knight f5, and then you're going to be able to win the pawn on d5 in just a moment. Also, after knight d6, you're putting pressure here on the pawn on e4. After, for example, knight to d2 to develop and defend that pawn, then black can go after the center with pawn to c6. A good tactic here is after pawn takes on c6, you can't recapture because then e5 is strong, but you can go for knight takes e4 in this position, using an attack against the queen here to gain time to capture on e4, destroy the white center. Now, Bronstein has better options than this, but this is basically lost, and because this line is very good, it will be tough for Bronstein to justify his play. So, after queen d4, though, we do see knight to b6 instead of that aggressive centralizing move, knight to d6, and pawn to c4. Bronstein is obviously getting ready here to roll up the board, and again, this is already another critical decision. Pawn to c5. Now, this is by no means losing, but I do think it is a significant inaccuracy that allows these two now, one of them passed pawns, connected pawns in the center of the board to become much more potent. And again, more accuracy will be needed from black to deal with these pawns after pawn c5. Instead, very strong here was the kind of undeveloping move, the unintuitive move, knight back to d7. There's the idea now of bishop to c5 and then queen e7, and the pawns will be restrained on the dark squares, and black has good development. This was a very effective option available to Rojahn, but again, unintuitive, undeveloping a piece, stepping back to gain control over the right squares. So after pawn c4 and then pawn c5, we see queen d3. That queen needs to move back. Of course, you're not capturing en passant and allowing a trade of queens. Bishop to g4, attacking the knight here on f3. Knight to d2, developing and defending and supporting that knight and supporting e4. And once again, an undeveloping computer move was a good response here for Rojahn. That is knight back to d7, and the computer even recommends following up with pawn g5. It's very important for black to blockade the pawns and to gain control over the dark squares. That is, of course, understandable, but again, when your opponent is playing so innovatively and so aggressively, it's hard to find this kind of an orthodox setup to get that blockade that you need. You want to kind of respond classically, I think, in many cases when your opponent is playing in this daring fashion, and often classical play is not going to get the job done. So after knight to d2, we see bishop to e7, not the strongest move, a relatively passive developing move. Both players now castle. Notice that Bronstein is unhurried. He knows that time will favor his pawns if he can slowly get them rolling after completing development. Knight e5, attacking that bishop, and the threat to the bishop is a serious one here, because even though the bishop is defended, you can't play a move like knight back to d7, because then after a trade, then you have queen e2 attacking the undefended knight, and you're going to get the pawns rolling with f4 first or e5. And once the pawns are rolling, they're very strong, and black's piece is not going to compete well against them. So after knight e5, we actually see bishop h5, which is one of the strongest computer moves, but of course, a move like bishop h5 does not make a great impression. Now, in this position, the strongest move for Bronstein was already to get his pawns rolling. And in that position, he has full compensation at this point. There have already been enough mistakes from Rojahn to fully justify this brilliant piece sacrifice. However, After bishop h5, Bronstein does make a small inaccuracy, pawn to b3. I think one of the key things here is we know that we need our pawns rolling. We don't necessarily know yet that the bishop belongs over here, so bringing the pawn up first and keeping some flexibility with the bishop was just a more natural way to play. After b3, we see knight d7, knight b to d7, challenging the knight here on e5, bishop to b2. We get a trade here. Knight takes e5, bishop takes e5. Notice that Bronstein doesn't fear the trades as long as he's getting ready to push the pawns. Knight back to d7 and bishop back to c3 here. Bishop f6 to challenge the knight. And I love Bronstein's next move. I think it's super instructive. It is rook a to e1, including the other rook here. It might, of course, look like this rook is getting entombed. Why would you want to bring this rook over to e1 and leave the rook on f1 nowhere to go? But of course, this anticipates the pawns getting rolling when all of white's pieces are participating. Again, always notice how masters have all of their pieces participating and somehow, some way, even though the opponent's moves seem to make sense, they will end up with pieces on their starting squares because they're not managing to find the critical moves in the critical moments and generate harmony in their pieces. Now, in this position, I think we see what is basically the critical, not quite losing mistake, but close to losing mistake from Rojahn. He must try to stop these pawns from advancing. There are basically two good ways to do it. Bishop g6, pinning this pawn here and repositioning the bishop, or rook over to e8, gaining control over e5. In both cases, the computer still does like black's position, but I think, of course, it's very difficult for a human to play black's position. Instead, though, Rojahn goes for more trades, and that's understandable. If you feel you're under pressure against a strong opponent, it's natural to trade pieces, but this is a critically poor decision that is going to allow Bronstein to send his pawns up the board. After bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, the pawns are moving, and Rojahn only helps that out with queen to f6, walking into the advance, pawn to e5. Now, probably Rojahn is thinking that he must activate his queen here, which does make sense, and he's hoping to blockade on the light squares, but he's not able to achieve that. Possibly he miscalculated in going for this line. Now he tries queen to f5, and after pawn to f4, the idea here is simply knight to e4, knight back to g3. That might just win material as you're hitting the queen and the bishop, and black's pieces are really struggling to compete, but it will at least get the pawns moving, and that's going to be a huge issue. In fact, there's a serious risk that this bishop here on h5 can be trapped, which is why the next move makes sense. Bishop back to g6, and you're really hoping to go in for queen d3 or queen c2, trade the queens, and totally change the nature of the game, but knight to e4. White has a huge space advantage at this point as the pawns have gotten moving, and as a result, Bronstein is not really interested in more trades unless it's helping his position make progress. Rook over to b8. I don't think this accomplishes much, but there's not much to do here, and queen to f3. This move threatens pawn to g4 and then pawn to f5, which is just going to win material on the spot. In fact, g4 right now would win the queen in this position, which is why bishop h7. A really sad move. And after the next move is getting the pawns up to f5, this bishop is basically a big pawn, but not the kind of big pawn we have here for white, just a big, sad pawn stuck in the edge of the board with no influence on the game. Famously, Bronstein, in one of his games, put a bishop on h7 and then on g8, entombing the bishop, but successfully defending his position and then reintroducing it later. One of the most famous defensive positional moves ever, but this bishop for Rojahn is never getting out, a totally different bishop. Also, we saw Bronstein versus Veresov in our best games of the 1960s, and in that game too, Bronstein set up a battery where the bishop was on h7, and he got his queen to g6 and not f5, but he had this battery with the king being castled queenside. Of course, white's king is in no danger here, and this battery is absolutely nothing for black, especially after the next move, pawn to g4. White has so much control in the position that you are not at all concerned about exposing your king by pushing the pawns. Instead, you're just gaining space and territory. White, I think, is winning at this point. Queen back to g6 and pawn to f5, burying this bishop forever. Queen over to b6, queen g3, getting ready for moves like pawn to g5, converting this into a winning attack here as black's king is in a world of hurt, and pawn to f6. I think this move is really kind of giving up almost, but I don't really have a better recommendation for Rojahn. What I mean is, once you play f6 and you allow e6, this bishop is never ever seeing the light of day, and you now have two connected passed pawns for white. I just don't see how there's any hope after f6 and e6 of your opponent even making a mistake at this point. It's just so stone cold winning for white. So let's see how Bronstein does win the game. Knight e5, pawn to h4, pushing forward with g5, king over to h8, pawn g5, that push that we were expecting, rook over to c8, doesn't do much, but there's not much to do. King h1, total patience here, just moving the king to a better square and maybe getting ready to use the g-file. Queen d8, pawn g6, further entombing the bishop, and the bishop says, okay, I can't go back any further. I'll never get off of g8, so I might as well get one pawn here for my life in this position. Pawn takes g6, b5, d6, the connected pawns are moving. There's a threat of pawn to e7. Queen to b6, dodging the threat of e7, now pawn d7, and black gives back another piece. At this point, it is Bronstein that is up a piece after sacrificing his piece way back in the opening phase of the game. Rook over to d8, and you can pick multiple wins here. Bronstein finds a beautiful one. It is the move knight takes f6. Very pretty, very tactical here. After knight takes f6, if you play rook takes f6, there is rook e8 check with a beautiful back rank mate with this strong pawn on g6, suppressing the black king here. And after knight takes f6, if you take with the pawn, of course, there's just g7 check and you're winning a rook, and of course, very easily winning the game. Now, after knight takes f6, the game concluded with queen to c6 check and queen back to g2. And in this position, Rojahn resigned right here. The problem here is even after you trade the queens, you can't take here on f6 with the rook because you still have the back rank issues. But after pawn takes f6, it is true that g7 check is no longer possible because there's no longer a queen on g2 to support it. But of course, white doesn't need that. There are many ways to win the position, but by far the most convincing and pretty is rook to e7. When black can move almost nothing, there's the threat of pawn g7 check. You can't even defend it with the passive rook over to g8 because there's rook h7 and a beautiful checkmate in one. So you really only have in this position king g8 to dodge g7, but you still play g7 and you've basically trapped the rook right here, because after rook f7, you have rook e8 check, winning a rook, thanks to the ideas of promoting this pawn. So after queen g2, blocking the check, Rojahn resigned in this game. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. It is one of my absolute favorites. I encourage you to check out more of Bronstein's games, more of his books. He is a truly incredible chess player, and to be entirely honest, I am kind of sad that he did not emerge as he maybe should have as world champion in his 1951 match, which he led most of the way against Mikhail Botvinnik. There's just something about being a world champion versus someone who tied a world chess championship match that leads to so much more deserved fame and glory, and would lead to so many more people knowing games like this from Bronstein. He is a player well worth your time, and I hope that you've enjoyed this game. For more of my best chess games of the 1950s, then simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.